Welcome to episode 3 of How to Be Your Possible Self. In this episode, we're going to have a brief stroll through time. If we take a quick stroll through history, we can see evidence of the general trend of ours to play it safe and hold on to what we believe to be true, rather than have to face the possibility that our belief is wrong. Acknowledging that one of our beliefs is incorrect can be very damaging to our self-schema and, in turn, our self-esteem. It can potentially lead us to doubting everything we hold to be true and force us down a path of massive effort and energy as we rethink who and what we are and what we stand for and believe in. Challenging the accepted worldview is dangerous. Examples that immediately come to us in our brief stroll through recent centuries would include Thomas Kuhn, Galileo, John Harrison, and the Spanish Inquisition. Thomas Kuhn, born July 18, 1922 in Cincinnati, North America, Thomas Kuhn was originally received a doctorate in theoretical physics from Harvard University. 2 years prior to receiving his doctorate, he was asked to teach a class of humanities majors on the subject of science and historical case studies within science. Whilst preparing his background material, it dawned on him that Newton's concepts of motion and matter were fundamentally different from Aristotle's physics, not a mere improvement. From there, he, as he put it, sweated blood and blood and blood. And finally, I had a breakthrough. He set out a theory that challenged at the highest levels the intellectual superiority of science and its practitioners. Until this time, science had seen itself as progressing in a calm and orderly fashion, painstakingly improving and refining itself with each new discovery. Kuhn turned that theory on his head, arguing instead that science was full of self-interest and rejection of ideas that might challenge the status quo, that it was full of ego rather than rationality. He argued that it was only in moments of intellectually violent revolutions, as he put it in the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that one conceptual worldview was replaced by another. The typical scientist, Kuhn argued, was not the objective free thinker and skeptic society believed him to be. Instead, he was a somewhat conservative individual who accepted what he was taught by his superiors and preferred the comfort of following intellectual tradition rather than the discomfort of intellectual progress which challenged the egos of superiors. Often, he argued, it took a young scientist not indoctrinated in the accepted theories, like Einstein, to sweep the old paradigms away. And you can imagine the feathers that Kuhn ruffled. Galileo. In the history of the world, Galileo Galilei stands as a symbol of the battle against authority for freedom of inquiry. In 1589, Galileo became professor of mathematics at Pisa, where he is reported to have shown his students, by dropping 2 balls of different weight from the leaning tower, that Aristotle had it wrong about the speed of fall being proportional to the weight of the falling object. His contract was not renewed by his Aristotelian superiors. Over the next few years, he challenged the fundamental beliefs of the ruling scientific aristocracy by publishing material that contradicted the governing beliefs in astronomy and hydrostatics. In 1613, he published a work on sunspots and predicted victory for the Copernican system of astronomy, which was the Earth was not the centre of the universe, but the Earth revolved around the Sun, not vice versa, which was the then held belief. A Pisan professor told his employers, who were also the leading family in Florence, that belief in a moving Earth was heretical. In 1614, a Florentine priest denounced Galileo from the pulpit. In response, Galileo wrote a long open letter on the irrelevance of biblical passages in scientific arguments, holding that interpretation of the Bible should be adapted to increase knowledge and that no scientific position should ever be made an article of faith. Early in 1616, Copernican books, any holding the view that the earth moved, were subject to censorship, and Cardinal Robert Bellarmine instructed Galileo that he must no longer hold or defend the concept that the earth moves. By 1633, despite his continued protestations of intellectual freedom, he was sentenced to life imprisonment by the Inquisition, and his material was ordered to be burned.
I don't know. Mr. Wentworth just told me to come in here and say that there was trouble at the mill, that's all. I didn't expect a kind of Spanish Inquisition.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Our chief weapon is surprise. Surprise and fear. Fear and surprise. Our two weapons are fear and surprise and ruthless efficiency. Our three weapons are fear and surprise and ruthless efficiency and an almost fanatical devotion to the Pope. Our four, no. Amongst our weapons, amongst our weaponry are such elements as fear. I'll come in again.
The sentence against him it was decreed to be read publicly in every university. He died, blind and under permanent house arrest, in 1642. An investigation into his condemnation was opened in 1979 by Pope John Paul II, and in October of 1992, a papal commission acknowledged the Vatican's error. John Harrison. A man of humble birth, John Harrison was a clockmaker, but from the early part of his clockmaking career, he proved himself a radical thinker. 18th century clocks were notoriously unstable, primarily because of the poor quality of the clock oils around at the time. But John and his brother James designed a clock that didn't use oil, a radical departure of thinking. Indeed, during the mid-1720s, he had invented a pendulum rod made of alternating wires of brass and steel, thus eliminating the problem of the pendulum's effective length increasing during warmer weather, slowing the clock. The result was that Harrison's clocks achieved an accuracy of 1 second in a month, a performance far exceeding the best clocks of the day. In 1675, King Charles II had founded the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, England, to solve the problem of finding longitude. Without accurate timepieces, sailors were at the very real risk of being completely lost at sea. The dominant view of science at the time was that by the use of accurate timekeeping, combined with the knowledge of the moon's position relative to Greenwich, longitude could be found. This was known as the lunar distance method. In 1714, the British government offered £20,000 for a solution that could provide longitude to within half a degree. A body known as the Board of Longitude was set up to administer and judge the entries, many of which were weird and wonderful. £20,000 was a vast sum of money in those days, and so every scientist and crank were equally inspired to make their name and their fortune. Harrison, being neither highly educated nor living in London, both of which were a prerequisite for snobbish scientific validity in those days, found it increasingly hard to convince the board he'd come up with the answer. His first clock, made to meet the challenge of the king, finished in 1735, was revolutionary. Spring-driven, all the moving parts were counterbalanced and controlled by springs, so that, unlike a pendulum clock, it was independent of the direction of gravity. Any change in motion which affected one of the balances was compensated for by the same effect on the other balance. Ingenious! But the board and the scientific establishment were convinced that the spectacular success in sea trials of Harrison's clocks in 1735 and 1736 were a fluke. They held steadfastly to the view that calculating lunar distance was going to prove far more accurate than a watch. At this stage, Harrison was 43 years of age. The board asked Harrisons for the designs for themselves to test their validity. This naturally worried Harrison due to the high risk of them stealing the idea and claiming it for themselves. They refused to hand over any money until he did, and even then, only half the prize. At 79 years of age, Harrison appealed to King George III via a letter to his private astronomer. A subsequent interview with the king led to the king allegedly remarking, "These people have been cruelly wronged," and "By God, Harrison, I'll see you righted." By 1773, he had been finally recognised as having solved the longitudinal problem. In the meantime, Captain Cook had set out on his second voyage, which ranged from the tropics to the Antarctic, and returned 3 years later in 1775. Cook referred to Harrison's watch as "our faithful guide through all the vicissitudes of climates," proving beyond doubt that longitude could be measured from a watch. John Harrison died on the 24th of March 1776, and it was his 83rd birthday. The Inquisition. In fact, there were at least 3 separate Inquisitions. In 1231, Pope Gregory IX placed inquisitors of heresy under his jurisdiction and established severe penalties. Whilst violence was against papal doctrine, some inquisitors, extremely powerful individuals who could accuse and prosecute even princes, developed a reputation for excessive cruelty and other abuses. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV officially sanctioned the use of torture to extract the truth from suspects. The principal subjects of attack in this particular period of Inquisition were heretics in southern France, witches, diviners, and the many popular misconceptions that resulted in a disturbance of public order. By the late 1300s, relatively little was heard of the Inquisition. Alarmed by the spread of Protestantism, Pope Paul III established the Roman Inquisition. Whereas the medieval Inquisition was concerned with popular beliefs, the Roman Inquisition concerned itself with orthodoxy of a more academic nature, especially as it appeared in the writings of theologians and high churchmen. In 1559, Pope Paul IV, a prime instigator of the Inquisition, published the first index of forbidden works. Galileo's works appeared in later editions of the index, and Galileo was tried and condemned in 1633. Separate from the medieval Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, so beloved of Monty Python fans, was established with papal approval at the request of King Ferdinand V and Queen Isabella I in 1478, ostensibly to deal with the problems of Jews who had been insincerely converted to Christianity. It eventually encompassed converted ex-Islamics and persons suspected of Protestantism.
I don't know. Mr. Wentworth just told me to come in here and say that there was trouble at the mill, that's all. I didn't expect a kind of Spanish Inquisition.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Our chief weapon is surprise. Surprise and fear. Fear and surprise. Our 2 weapons are fear and surprise and ruthless efficiency. Our 3 weapons are fear and surprise and ruthless efficiency and an almost fanatical devotion to the Pope. Our 4, no. Amongst our weaponry are such elements as fear. I'll come in again.
Within a few years, the papacy disowned it, and thus the Spanish Inquisition became an instrument of the state rather than the church. It enjoyed political support, especially from Philip II, and created its first star, the first and most notorious Grand Inquisitor, Thomas de Torquemada, who executed thousands of reputed heretics. Its witnesses, who could remain anonymous, were all that was needed to send a man to his death for a heretical act which included alleged sorcery. Goodness knows how many great minds, scientific discoveries, and how much cultural progress might have been burnt at the stake, beheaded or drowned, all for the crime of daring to challenge the accepted wisdom of the day and the self-esteem and egos of the great and the good. Even today, acts of scientific and cultural heresy are punished by the heretic's peers. There's the North American GP who steadfastly held to his 30-year claim of the health benefits of a purely red meat diet. The denouncers of scientific emperors in their new clothes. Those who argue that medical practice needs to be proactive as well as reactive, including the use of herbal and non-pharmaceutical alternatives. Those that argue the traditional capitalist business model of bosses and scores of workers in a hierarchical power arrangement is dead. Society, including popular culture and the scientific establishment, takes a long time to change its mind about anything, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. A worldview is a very hard thing to change. Huge ships don't stop or turn on a coin. The vast majority of decisions we take in our life are made to preserve the truthfulness of our mental rules. Consequently, those who hold beliefs that others might call superstitions will seek evidence to support their beliefs, not undermine them. Even those of us who believe ourselves to be fairly open-minded are in reality a warehouse full of prejudices, albeit with some of these prejudices set in porridge, not concrete. Okay, let's consider behaviour shaping. Our self-schema, like our physical and mental experiences, shape our behaviour. If our self-schema has us as very unsporty types, then we'll pass up the opportunity to kick a ball around with our friends and children or have a game of tennis. Similarly, if our self-schema has it that we are a failure, then we will always behave in a way that confirms this belief about ourselves. To become a success when we believe we don't deserve to be a success and we're supposed to be a failure can be devastatingly hard. A road paved with good intentions but doomed to failure because we'll keep tripping ourselves up. More importantly, actually becoming a success under these mental conditions completely throws us. The Evening Standard newspaper in London reported on the 3rd of June 1998 on the sad story of a man who, by his late 30s, had achieved much material success. But he took his own life. He was reportedly bored with life and therefore ended it, leaving behind a wife and several children. Now, as someone who with a keen interest in human motivation, I have to question the view that being bored with life led to his suicide. Was it because he was bored of being successful and having a lifestyle that a great many would envy that he killed himself? Or was it perhaps that fundamentally he felt unworthy of his success and lifestyle and took his own life as a way of stopping his head's inner voice from screaming at him? Was he convinced that he would shortly be found out, that he was a fraud, that his life was a house of cards that was going to collapse any day now? You see, when our beliefs are in opposition to what is actually happening, we enter a psychological state called cognitive dissonance. It is mentally a very painful state to be in, and our mind rapidly moves to reduce the conflict within us. The conflict between our beliefs and what we see is actually happening. We can find reasons for the conflict and thus rationalise it away. We can ignore it and hope it goes away, or we can move to attack the cause of our conflict and then beat it into submission. You can see cognitive dissonance at work when looking at the news on TV. If, for example, a politician does something which on the surface seems kind, caring and noble, a great many of us would first be cheered to see it. Then our mental map of the world, our schema, would say to us, but politicians never do anything without an ulterior motive that benefits them. So we would immediately construct all sorts of arguments as to why the politician performed the selfless and noble act. Such as, perhaps, because they perceive there are votes in it, or they have secret shares in the benefiting organisation, or something similar. We would seek to rebalance our belief of a politician's behaviour with the evidence of their behaviour in front of us. Or it could be our teenage child performing an unusually selfless and generous act which seemingly benefits us and costs them. our delight at their offer or behaviour would possibly trigger a reaction against our beliefs about them, resulting in our searching for ulterior motive and benefits to them. And what was it that Jerry Hall allegedly said about Mick Jagger? When he brings me flowers for no apparent reason, I know he's done something bad. Cognitive dissonance then can be a powerful indicator of our map of the world, our schema, as well as our map or belief about ourselves, our self-schema. When we are feeling uncomfortable about a situation, it is usually because our beliefs are being threatened. So, let's sum up. We are born into this world with a rudimentary sense of self that determines how we react to and with others. Through a process of trial and error, we refine our expectations of ourselves and our world to the point where we apply filters to limit the amount of information bombarding us through our senses. These filters in turn dictate our behaviours. It's vital to know what your filters are, why you have them, and what benefits and costs your self-made rules for living deliver to you. Well, that's this episode of the Possible Self podcast wrapped up. If you'd like to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss anything, head over to Apple Podcasts and search for the podcast by name. That is, How to Be Your Possible Self. Next episode, we'll look at the power of childhood influences to either help us or hinder us. See you then.